Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to talk about the Battle of Verneuil, fought on the 17th of August 1424. This battle was called the Second Agincourt, and it was one of the bloodiest, or maybe the bloodiest battle of the 100 Years' War. But the reason I want to talk about this battle, that is not very well known, is that it was basically a personal affair. It was a grudge match between the English and the Scottish. Always, of course, the English and the Scottish had issues from the Scottish Wars of Independence, but this was in a really extent that we've never seen before. So in order to understand why this was such an important and personal affair between these two nations, we have to go 10 years ago at the Battle of Agincourt. After the Battle of Agincourt, the French were reluctant to fight the English in a pitched battle. The disaster of Agincourt made the French afraid, they were scared, they didn't field armies, and at that time was where you started seeing more Scottish troops in France. And the Scottish troops being very well trained, they were usually men-at-arms. At that time, the Scots didn't have schultrons in France, they had really only men-at-arms and mounted knights. So after Agincourt, as we said, the French were reluctant to fight. Now, before Henry V left for England, he left his brother, the Duke of Clarence, as Lieutenant of France. The Duke of Clarence was a very, very popular commander, very popular royal. He was very, people were very fond of him, and soldiers as well. He was very charismatic. To understand his mentality, we have to mention that he missed Agincourt. He was one of the nobles and the soldiers who got sick during the siege of Harfleur, and he was sent back to England. So you have to understand his disappointment of missing such a huge victory and his eagerness to prove himself. And this state of mind is very important for us to understand what happened. So Clarence was left with some really great captains and commanders in Normandy to support him. Salisbury, Umphraville, one of my favorite commanders, I have to say, Somerset, Huntington and Ross were the captains that were supporting the Duke of Clarence during his raids and while he was governing the victories and the lands that Henry V gained after his campaign. In January 1421, 6,000 volunteers from Scotland came to France, very well trained men-at-arms, under Archibald Douglas and John Stuart, 3rd Earl of Buchan. We have to know that the Scottish nobles were becoming very prominent in the French army. The king made the Earl of Buchan was the Constable of France. Douglas and other commanders were gaining a lot of estates, and although they were supporting the French with a large number of very well-trained men-at-arms, the French nobles were not very fond of them. So March 1421, Clarence led a series of raids through Anjou and Maine. So he reached close to the area of Beaujeu. You can see the Hog. This is where Beaujeu is. This map is of the area that he was raiding. You see Caen, Lisieux and all these areas. And he heard from the scouts that was a small Scottish party close to La Ville Beaujeu. Now I have to understand he was raiding with a small number of men-at-arms. At that time, it was the army was dispersed. There were some people were hunting, others were in different cities around the areas that the English conquered. So he was with a number of men-at-arms, but he didn't have the whole army. So when this Clarence heard this, he immediately marched to Beaujeu in order to cross the river to La Ville Beaujeu and attack the Scottish, where he was stopped by his captains, while Earl of Salisbury tried to convince him to wait until he started gathering the soldiers, especially the lumbermen. The lumbermen were not with them. The Duke of Clarence had only men-at-arms. His captains were impossible to convince him, although Salisbury left immediately to gather more forces, and this is why I told you have to understand his mentality. He wanted to prove himself. He missed Agincourt, and he was a great commander. So without listening, he gathered his men-at-arms and mounted. He moved towards Beaujeu, La Ville Beaujeu. As you can see here, the Scottish were over the river in La Ville Beaujeu. They were not expecting the English, and but there was more Scottish and French forces behind the ridge. So as soon as Clarence saw the Scottish, he charged. He tried to cross the river, and without longbowmen, without waiting for anyone, and the Scots were waiting for him there. And there was the famous Battle of Beaujeu that was fought on 22nd of March 1421. Now John Carmichael of Douglasdale unhorsed him, and breaking his lance in the process, an event which is immortalized in the crest of the Clan Carmichael. So you can see the crest above. Also Alexander Buchanan, who was credited with the killing of the Duke, with his mace and holding the dead Duke's coronet aloft on his lance in triumph. So it was a disaster for the English. The Scots were obviously more, and more came from the ridge, and the Duke of Clarence was actually killed in a quite humiliating way. So you understand, the very popular commander and captain, and of course royal, like the Duke of Clarence, the shock that the English got after his death, and how, let's say, they were waiting to get revenge from the Scottish. Now, in the summer of 1424, 2 years later, the English army under the command of Bedford, a very experienced Earl of Salisbury, who we know tried to stop Clarence and told him to wait to bring the longbowmen, laid siege to a French stronghold of Ivry, 42 kilometers northeast of Verneuil. Verneuil was under English command. You have to understand. You see the locations here I put in the Google Maps where Verneuil is and where Ivry is. And he heard that the town of Verneuil was taken by the Scottish and the French. The town was taken by a very simple ruse. A group of Scots, leading some of their fellow countrymen as prisoners, pretending to be English, and claimed that Bedford had defeated the Allies in battle, whereupon the gates were opened. So a very clever ruse from the Scots. Now, Bedford immediately moved towards Verneuil with his army, and at that time there was a debate inside Verneuil what's going to happen. The Scottish were pushing to go out and meet the English in pitched battle. The nobles of France, the elderly nobles, not elderly, the nobles who were at Agincourt were not willing to fight, but the young French nobles with the Scottish convinced the French commanders to meet the English in pitched battle. Now the French had commanders, John VII of Harcourt, Count of Aumale, and William II of Narbonne were the commanders for the French, and the commanders for the Scottish, which, as we said, were John Stuart, Earl of Buchan, and Archibald Douglas. For the English, the French had 10,000 men-at-arms, with Scottish 6,500 very well trained and equipped Italian knights. The English were under the Duke of Bedford and John of Lancaster, the first Duke of Bedford, and under Thomas Montague, the fourth Earl of Salisbury, two really great commanders who played an important role in the latter part of the 100 Years' War, and their demise was a demise for the English. The English were about 10,000 men-at-arms, so there was almost double, not double, but the English had a good force. 10,000 men-at-arms. The English were much better equipped. They had better soldiers. The French was quite weak army. There were a lot of people who didn't actually know how to fight very well, and they were trained by the captains. The Scottish had really well-trained army at that battlefield. So if you go now to the battle, before we go to the battle, there are two options, two let's say stories regarding how the French deployed and the Scottish, according to Byrne and according to Warren. Obviously we know that the French were on the left flank and the Scottish on the right flank, but in a continuous line, and obviously the Bedford was on the right flank of the English and the Salisbury on the left flank of the English, and the longbowmen were probably mixed in between, and in the back the English had some 2,000 longbowmen in the baggage train, protecting the baggage train, protected by baggage, by carts and tethered horses. Now the difference from the two historians comes where the Italian lights were. There's two options, one that they were in the center in front of the Scots and that had one attack against Salisbury, and the second was that they were into both flanks and attacked the flanks of Salisbury and Bedford. I would think, as I've studied the battle and I fought the battle, and I thought about it and read, obviously, people who had opinions on it. I would go with the worrying opinion that the knights were at the center of the army, not in the flanks. I will explain to you later why I'm thinking this. So before the battle, Douglas is said to have received a message from Bedford that had come to drink with him and prayed for an early meeting. Douglas replied that having failed to find the Duke in England, he had came to seek him in France. It's nice banter there. Bedford is also said to have sent herald to Douglas once both armies had been deployed to ask what terms for battle he required, to which Douglas grimly replied that the Scots will neither give nor receive any quarter. So you see, there was a big personal grudge match here between the Scottish and the English, and that had to do with the death of Duke of Clarence 2 years ago. So when we start the battle, let's start the battle and see what happened very quickly. So you see the English deployed on the French. You have 4,000 men-at-arms from each division for Salisbury and Bedford, and 10,000 for the French on the left, and 6,000 the Scottish on the right, with 500 mounted knights. Lombards will go for the option that the knights are in front of the Scottish, and 2,000 Longbowmen in the back protecting the baggage train. Now what happened? The Italian, something I missed. Let's go back and see here the horses, how the horses were for the Italians. You see how well, very well equipped and protected the horses were. They had the best armor of the period, and you can see here this is from the Hobbyland magazine. You can see here all the parts of the horse. So they were very well trained French knights who would be quite difficult for the English longbowmen to succeed with such an armor. Actually, the longbow was becoming less and less effective at that time. So as you can see here, deployment, as we said before, what happened? Well, the Italians charged towards mostly Salisbury's division, towards the longbowmen and the men-at-arms. At that time, it was a very hot summer morning, and the stakes could not be placed very well. The field were dry, so the stakes was very difficult to be placed, and the stakes broke. And the French knights attacked and basically ran over the English longbowmen and the men-at-arms. It was panic during this charge. People were running, people were deserting. There is a famous story about a captain who deserted, and later he was hand-drawn and quartered by Bedford. And basically what happened was the stakes could not hold. The ground was really dry from heat. So the French broke through, destroyed the stakes, and broke the English lines, and the English started deserting. Now, the mistake for the mounted knights were that they didn't take advantage of this break. The Scottish army and the French army were very far away, took advantage of the break of the break of lines, and the Italians, thinking they did the job, charged the baggage. Was quite a few miles away. But Bedford and Salisbury were very good commanders with very well-trained captains. They reordered the lines and they started charging towards the French. As you can see here, Salisbury was waiting for the Scottish who were charging him. So Salisbury was attacked by the Scottish, Bedford attacked the French. At that time, in the back, the Italian knights were destroyed by the English longbowmen in the reserves. The English longbowmen were behind tethered horses, behind carts. They were basically as fortified, and they were annihilated, they were routed. While the battle was ongoing, and actually Salisbury was really hard pushed by the Scots, the English longbowmen started a run to try to outflank, as you can see here, the French. They charged the French from the flanks, and that's where the French, who were weaker and not very good quality, this division was not very good quality, as it's said by the historians, broke and ran after them and actually killed every single one, killing Norbonne, killing Aumal. They drowned them in the moat of Verneuil. The Verneuil people did not open the gates for the French, and the French were captured and killed in front of the city. Then basically Bedford turned around And although Salisbury was very hard pressed by the Scots, turned around and attacked the Scots from the back and basically charging them, and that was a massacre. Of course, we knew before that there was not going to be any quarter given or taken, so the Scots were killed to the last fighter. It was the bloodiest battle in history of the 100 Years' War, but it was personal. It was personal because while the English were moving and were marching towards the enemy, they were stopping every 10 meters, 20 meters to reorganize, 50 meters to reorganize themselves, and then they were shouting, "A Clarence, a Clarence, a Clarence, a Clarence." You have to understand how personal this was. In the end, as you can see, 1,600 English killed, while 6,000 French and Scottish were killed and 200 captured. So I think I gave you a good overview of the battle, guys. I want to explain to you why this battle is very interesting to me, not only because it was an important battle, it was the bloodiest battle of the 100 Years' War, but it was personal. It was personal due to the death and the killing of the Duke of Clarence, a very popular royal by the Scottish. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you liked the video. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend.